The forest floor was covered in fresh boot prints, none of them matching their own. First, they thought it was a joke. Daniel was the one who spotted them. He had stepped away from camp at dawn to relieve himself and returned with a tightness in his jaw that didn't fit the softness of the morning. Mist lay low between the trunks, pale as breath, and the air smelled of damp soil and crushed pine needles. Their tents were beaded with condensation. Nothing about the clearing suggested intrusion, except the ground. Boot prints pressed deep into the dark earth, circling the perimeter of their camp. Clean edges, crisp heel marks, a defined tread pattern none of them recognized. "Maybe we walked over there last night," Priya said, though she didn't sound convinced. She crouched and held her own boot beside one of the impressions. The tread didn't match. Hers had a triangular lug pattern. The print in the dirt had parallel bars, almost military in their precision. Ethan checked his, then Mara, then Daniel again, slower this time. None of them matched. The prints didn't overlap with theirs. They didn't intersect. They moved in a careful arc around the tents, skirting the dying embers of last night's fire, keeping a consistent distance, 10 feet, maybe 12, from where they'd slept. "Could have been here before us," Ethan offered. He gestured vaguely toward the woods. "Old trail or something." Daniel shook his head. He pressed his fingers into the soil beside one of the impressions. The earth was still moist beneath the surface crust. "These are fresh." The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Birds called somewhere far off, but not nearby. The clearing itself was oddly still, as if the sound had been turned down. They told themselves it was nothing. Another camper passing through, a ranger checking on illegal fires. The forest was big, but not empty. They packed for the day hike anyway. The trail they'd planned to follow was barely a trail at all, a faint depression through fern and moss leading deeper into the state forest. The trees thickened as they went, trunks crowding closer, their bark furrowed and dark with moisture. Light filtered down in fractured beams, catching drifting gnats and turning them into floating flecks of gold. An hour in, Mara stopped abruptly. "Okay," she said. "That's not funny." Ahead of them, the forest floor was marked again. Boot prints, the same tread pattern, the same crisp, deliberate impressions. They crossed the faint trail at a right angle, disappearing into a stand of tightly packed spruce. Daniel crouched again, studying them. "They're on top of ours." Priya blinked. "What?" He pointed. Their own scuffed trail, broken twigs, flattened moss, was partially obscured by the newer prints. Whoever had made them had stepped exactly where they had stepped. Heel over heel, toe over toe. But the size was wrong. Slightly larger than Ethan's. Slightly narrower than Daniel's. Ethan let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "So someone's following us." "No," Mara said quietly. "They're copying us." The forest felt different after that. It wasn't anything they could name at first. Just a subtle distortion. Sound didn't travel the way it should have. When Priya snapped a twig underfoot, the crack seemed swallowed immediately, as if the trees had leaned closer to listen. The wind moved high in the canopy, but nothing stirred at eye level. They turned back toward camp. The boot prints reappeared twice more on the return, each time closer together, as if the stride had shortened. Once, they formed a half circle in the middle of the path, toes pointing inward, like an audience gathered around something that was no longer there. By the time they reached the clearing, the air had cooled noticeably. The sun was still high, but its warmth felt diluted, filtered through something unseen. Their camp looked untouched, except for the ground. The boot prints had multiplied. They no longer skirted the perimeter. They filled it. Dozens of impressions overlapped and interwove, forming spirals and tight loops around the tents. Some faced inward, some outward. A few pressed so close to the tent flaps that the fabric sagged slightly from where someone, or something, had brushed against it. "No," Ethan said softly. "No, no, no." Daniel moved slowly around the clearing, counting under his breath. The tread pattern was identical in every print. Same size, same depth, as if one person had walked in impossibly complex patterns without ever misstepping. "They're not random," Mara murmured. She was right. From above, if you could have seen it from above, the arrangement would have revealed a design. The spirals tightened toward the center of the clearing, converging near the fire pit. The lines intersected in deliberate ways, forming shapes that felt almost geometric. Intentional. Priya's breathing quickened. "We need to leave," they packed with shaking hands. No one suggested staying another night. The forest pressed close around the clearing, trunks standing like silent witnesses. As they hoisted their packs, a low hum seemed to pass through the ground. Not a sound exactly, more a vibration felt in the soles of their boots. The air held it for a moment, then released. "Did you?" Ethan began. "Yes," Daniel said. They started toward the trailhead, moving faster than before. The forest felt narrower now. Branches snagged at their sleeves. The light shifted unpredictably, bright patches blooming where there should have been shade, shadows pooling in open spaces. Half a mile in, Mara stumbled. The ground ahead was a churned mosaic of boot prints. Hundreds of them. They covered the earth in dense formation, arranged in long parallel lines that stretched between the trees like corridors. Each line was straight, unwavering, and evenly spaced from the next. "They're making paths," Priya whispered. The lines extended in multiple directions, radiating outward from a central point somewhere deeper in the forest. Daniel stepped into one of the corridors despite himself. The prints aligned perfectly beneath his feet, guiding his stride. Heel, toe, heel, toe. He stopped abruptly. The print beneath his boot matched. Not his tread pattern, the other one. He lifted his foot slowly. The impression in the soil remained unchanged. Ethan swore. "That's not possible." Daniel scraped his boot against a patch of moss beside the corridor and stepped back into the line. This time, when he lifted his foot, the print had changed. The parallel bars of the unknown tread had blurred at the edges, shifting subtly, resolving into the triangular lug pattern of his own boot. A cold realization seeped through them. "They're not following us," Mara said, her voice thin. "They're learning us." The forest answered with silence. A breeze moved through the canopy, but at ground level, the air remained still. The hum returned, stronger now, vibrating through their bones. The boot prints began to shift. It was subtle at first, a soft crumbling at the edges, soil collapsing inward. Then the impressions deepened, as if weight pressed down from above. New prints formed at the front of each corridor, appearing one after another in perfect rhythm. Step, step, step. But no one was there. The lines advanced toward them. Ethan backed away, shaking his head. "We're leaving. Now." They broke into a run, abandoning the corridors, crashing through underbrush instead of following any path. Branches whipped at their faces. Roots caught at their ankles. The forest seemed to lean inward, closing gaps, tightening around them. Behind them, the rhythmic deepening of prints continued. Step, step, step. By the time they burst into a patch of thinner trees near the edge of the forest, they were breathless and wild-eyed. Sunlight spilled freely here, bright and ordinary. They slowed, stumbling to a stop. The ground ahead was undisturbed. No boot prints, no patterns, just leaf litter and dry soil. Ethan laughed shakily. "See? It's just." He trailed off. They turned back toward the forest. At the threshold where dense trees gave way to open land, the boot prints had stopped as well. They formed a straight, unbroken line along the tree line, toes pointed outward. Facing them, dozens of identical impressions, side by side, as if something stood just within the shadows, watching. The hum faded. The forest returned to ordinary sound. Birds calling, wind moving freely. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Mara looked down at her own boots. The tread was wrong. Where there should have been triangular lugs, there were parallel bars, identical to the prints. "Guys," she whispered. One by one, they checked. Every sole had changed. Behind them, in the thin soil of the clearing's edge, for new sets of prints marked their exit from the forest. Crisp, fresh, parallel bars pressed deep into the earth. And inside the tree line, just beyond sight, a second set of impressions, triangular lugs, had begun to circle a space large enough for tents. A low humming came from beneath the tent, steady and mechanical, like something waking up. First, none of them moved. The sound threaded itself through the damp dark the way a distant generator might. Faint, constant, almost polite. It blended with the forest's own nighttime breath. The far-off murmur of wind through pine needles, the intermittent click of cooling branches, the hush of insects tuning their thin instruments. Jonah shifted in his sleeping bag. "You guys hear that?" Mina's reply was muffled by nylon and down. "Wind. It's not wind." The tent floor was cold against Jonah's palm. Moisture had wicked up from the soil, leaving a faint, clammy slickness on the fabric. Earlier that evening, they joked about the ground feeling hollow beneath them, too springy, like a mattress that hadn't settled properly. Now, pressing his hand flat, he felt it. A tremor so subtle it was almost imagined. A steady vibration traveling up through bone rather than air. The humming didn't waver. It had a rhythm, but not one he recognized from nature. Not the irregular rasp of crickets or the restless murmur of wind. This was clean, even, mechanical. Outside, the forest held its breath. "Probably someone camping nearby," Mina said, though there was no conviction in it. They had hiked 6 hours to get here, past the last marked trail, past even the old ranger signs that had long since rotted into suggestion. The clearing was shallow and ringed by cedar, the ground thick with damp needles and the metallic scent of soil that had been turned and settled for decades. No other tents, no firelight, no distant engines. The humming deepened. It wasn't louder, not yet, but it seemed closer, more present. The fabric of the tent quivered faintly, condensation trembling in tiny beads along the seams. Armin unzipped his sleeping bag. The rasp of nylon against nylon sounded indecently loud. "I'm checking." "Don't," Mina said quickly. He paused, hand hovering over the zipper of the tent door. The sound beneath them shifted, barely. A slight acceleration, then a return to its steady hum. Like it had reacted. They all felt it. Armin withdrew his hand. The temperature inside the tent dropped a degree or two. Just enough that Jonah noticed his breath plume faintly in the beam of his headlamp when he switched it on. The light seemed weaker than before, the beam absorbed too quickly by the close air. "It's probably groundwater," Jonah said, though he didn't believe it. "Pipes or something." "In the middle of nowhere?" Mina whispered. The humming changed again. This time it took on a cadence. Slow, measured. Pause, then a tremor. Pause, then tremor. Jonah's pulse stumbled as recognition crawled over him. It was mimicking a heartbeat. Thud-hum, thud-hum. Too even to be organic. Too perfect. Armin swallowed. "It's sinking." "Sinking with what?" Mina asked. No one answered. The pattern shifted once more. Faster now. The intervals shortening. Jonah felt his own pulse quicken in response. A subconscious attempt to outrun the imitation. The humming followed, adjusting itself with quiet precision. Thud-hum, thud-hum, thud-hum. It matched him. He went very still. The forest outside began to thin. Not physically, but sonically. The insect's steady chorus faltered, then stuttered into silence. The wind, which had been weaving through the trees, dulled into nothing. Even the small, settling pops of cooling would cease. The world narrowed to nylon, breath, and that humming. Armin's headlamp flickered. Once, twice. The shadows inside the tent stretched and bent in ways that didn't correspond to the light source. Mina watched her own silhouette tremble against the fabric wall, elongated and slightly delayed, as if it were a fraction of a second behind her movements. "Okay," she whispered. "This isn't normal." The ground shifted. Not dramatically, just a subtle settling, as though something beneath them had adjusted its posture. The tent floor rose a centimeter, then fell. The humming expanded outward, They felt it beyond the tent now, vibrating through the earth in widening rings. The tree trunks around the clearing began to resonate faintly, a low sympathetic murmur joining the original tone. The sound no longer came solely from below, it came from everywhere. Jonah crawled toward the tent door and unzipped it an inch. Cold air slid inside, sharp and metallic. The clearing looked unchanged in the weak spill of headlamp light. Dark soil, scattered roots, the outline of trees. But the shadows were thicker than they should have been, pooling unnaturally around the bases of trunks. The humming rippled through the trees. A branch overhead shuddered, not from wind, but from vibration. Then the pattern changed again. This time it resembled breathing. Inhale, rising pitch. Exhale, falling hum. Inhale, exhale. Slow at first, measured, artificial. Mina clutched her own throat without realizing it. Her breathing faltered, then unconsciously aligned with the rhythm beneath them. Jonah noticed and deliberately held his breath. The humming continued, unaffected. Armin crawled closer to the tent wall and pressed his ear against the floor. His face drained of color. "It's layered," he said quietly. "There are levels." Jonah joined him, ear to the damp fabric. The soil scent was stronger there, wet iron and rot. Beneath the primary hum, he heard it, fainter oscillations, overlapping frequencies like stacked machinery. Not random, structured, as if multiple systems were booting up in sequence. The headlamp flickered again, then steadied. Beyond the clearing, something shifted between the trees, not a shape but a distortion. The darkness itself seemed to ripple, bending as though viewed through heat haze. The trunks appeared slightly misaligned, edges doubling before snapping back. The humming pulsed in response. Mina's phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket. She yelped, the sound too loud in the suffocating quiet. She pulled it out. No signal as expected, but the screen was on. A voice memo app had opened. Recording. The timer ticked upward. None of them had touched it. Armin leaned over her shoulder. The waveform displayed on screen was steady and symmetrical, rising and falling in perfect time with the humming beneath the tent. It wasn't just making sound. It was mapping itself. The temperature dropped again. Condensation thickened along the tent walls, droplets trembling in rhythmic unison before sliding downward. Outside, the trees leaned just perceptibly toward the clearing. Not physically bending, but oriented, focused. The breathing pattern quickened, then shifted. The rise and fall sharpened, subdividing into smaller pulses. Staccato bursts threaded through the larger rhythm. Jonah's stomach nodded as comprehension dawned. It wasn't breathing anymore. It was forming syllables. Not words, nothing so human, but structured bursts of tone, arranged in repeating clusters. A language stripped of air and vocal cords. Pure vibration. The waveform on Mina's phone began to show repeating patterns. Armin's headlamp died. Darkness swallowed the tent, thick and immediate. The humming intensified, filling the space until it felt less like sound and more like pressure against their skulls. Jonah's teeth ached. His vision shimmered even in the dark. Outside, faint lines of pale light traced themselves between tree trunks, barely visible, like veins glowing under skin. They pulsed in sync with the sound, branching outward from the clearing. "It's not under us," Mina breathed. "We're on top of it." The realization settled heavily. This clearing hadn't been random. The ground's springiness, the unusual warmth earlier that evening, the lack of underbrush, as if something had kept the surface clear. The humming dropped an octave. The earth beneath the tent shifted again, more pronounced this time. A slow, rising swell that lifted them together before easing down, like a massive diaphragm expanding. Jonah understood then. This wasn't a creature. There was no singular body, no hidden form coiled in the dirt. It was infrastructure, ancient, buried systems stretching far beyond the limits of the clearing. Metal or stone or something older threaded through the forest floor in vast geometric arrays. Networks lying dormant for centuries, perhaps millennia, and they had pitched their tent on a node. The humming steadied into a new pattern, no longer mimicking them, no longer experimenting. It was broadcasting. The forest responded. From the darkness beyond the trees came answering vibrations, faint but synchronized. The glow between trunks intensified, lines connecting, forming an immense lattice that extended into the hills. The sound no longer felt curious, felt aware. Mina's phone screen flashed. The recording timer stopped on its own. A notification appeared. File saved. Initialization_complete. None of them had typed anything. The humming began to recede, not in volume, but in immediacy. The pressure eased. The glow dimmed. The trees returned to still silhouettes. The vibration beneath the tent softened into a low, constant baseline hum. Dormant again, but not asleep. Jonah didn't speak for a long time. Neither did the others. Eventually, the insects resumed their chorus. The wind found its voice between the branches. The forest reassembled its familiar sounds with delicate care. But beneath it all, steady and patient, the mechanical hum remained. Not random, not natural. Waiting. Far below the damp soil and tangled roots, an ancient system had awakened, mapped the surface, sampled their rhythms, recorded their breath. And somewhere in its vast, buried network, something had recognized the pattern of human life above it, and adjusted,